We're now entering into the public comment session, and each speaker has 3 minutes to speak. There would not be any questions, but these are individual talks that are given for the edification of the committee. Our first speaker is Sarah Ohlhorst from American Society for Nutrition. I was told that Augustina Sense, is she here?
Either one's fine. Okay. All right. The American Society for Nutrition appreciates the opportunity to comment on the process used to develop the dietary guidelines for Americans. ASN is a scientific professional society with more than 5,000 members who conduct nutrition research to help all individuals live healthier lives. The major challenge ASN members face in implementing the DGAs is that regular updates of the dietary reference intakes are needed. The DGAs are dependent on the DRIs, but the DRIs are outdated. The DRIs must be based on current scientific evidence to ensure that identification of nutrients of public health concern and other nutrient needs used in the development of the DGAs are accurate. Updating the DRIs should be prioritized before the next edition of the DGAs is developed. Additionally, the USDA Food and Nutrition Database and other relevant databases that serve as the foundation for nutrients and dietary patterns must be continually updated. ASN supports the continued use of a strong evidence-based approach to inform the development of future editions of the DGAs. ASN also supports rigorous systematic review of all the evidence on key topics based on the National Academy's Standards for Systematic Review. Consideration is needed on how to strategically update the availability of new evidence for systematic reviews in the Nutrition Evidence Library. Achievement of high quality of evidence requires continued investment in nutrition research that promotes the health of all Americans. This peer-reviewed scientific evidence provides the fundamental basis for the DGAs. ASN sees many opportunities for future editions of the DGAs to promote chronic disease prevention and ensure nutritional sufficiency. The DGAs have an opportunity to go beyond advising Americans on what to eat and will help Americans and others understand how to change their behavior in order to improve eating habits, nutrients consumed, to better prevent chronic disease. Future editions of the DGAs may also feature culturally specific dietary patterns and recommendations to better reflect our multicultural society. Chronic disease prevention should continue to be a focus of future DGAs. ASN supports the consideration of diet and nutritional biomarkers for chronic disease endpoints when developing dietary recommendations that address health and disease. However, the development of recommendations should not be hindered or delayed by the process of discovery and validation of nutritional biomarkers for diet-related disease risk. More emphasis on implementing the DGAs and moving Americans toward DGA compliance is needed. ASN recommends that collaborators continue to be engaged to ensure the DGAs are widely disseminated to the public and will support improved public health outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there a representative from the Physicians Committee for Responsible Nutrition here?
I'm on the list. She's on.
You're on there later as well? Okay, I got it now. You're there twice. Next speaker is Robert Burns from the Grocery Manufacturers Association.
Okay, thanks. The grocery manufacturers represents the majority of food manufacturers. Our association does. As discussed previously in testimony to this committee, we support the periodic updates of the dietary guidelines to assure that current scientific knowledge is applied to guide federal nutrition policies and assist the public in developing eating patterns that will prevent chronic disease and assure nutrient adequacy. We especially appreciate the dedication and work of this committee to review the DGA process and suggest improvements. As mentioned in previous testimony, GMA and its membership would like to see the process enhanced by more systematically addressing biases and conflicts of interest on the DGAC and greater transparency. Attention to these aspects will enhance the credibility of the final product with the broad audiences, including consumers. In these comments, I'd like to address the role of the food industry in implementing the dietary guidelines by reviewing some past activities and some future opportunities. Industry responds to consumer demands by developing new products and reformulating existing products. This consumer demand is driven in turn by a range of factors, including authoritative recommendations, public health recommendations such as the dietary guidelines. For instance, we track GMA member work since 2002 and found that over 30,000 new products were reformulated to give consumers greater choices with fewer calories, reduced fat, sugar, and sodium. But the number of products alone doesn't communicate the public health impact. Independently corroborated work by the Healthy Weight Commitment Foundation demonstrated that food and beverage manufacturers removed 6.4 trillion calories from the food supply by changing recipes to existing products, including new low-calorie options and providing single-serve options. A report last September from What We Eat in America's Food Survey Research Group demonstrated that between 2003-4 period and 2011-12, the intake of added sugars, solid fats, and solid fats significantly decreased across the age spectrum, including children. Over the same period, whole grain intake significantly increased, while total vegetable, fruit, dairy, and meats were unchanged. This indicates that the processed food industry does respond to dietary recommendations and can affect nutrient intake. Building on these past successes, there is an opportunity for industry to play an even greater role in the future. A more comprehensive consumer education effort around the dietary guidelines could enhance consumer demand, which will result in new products to meet the demand. You've heard earlier about the role of the DGAs in federal policy. They also have potential to influence consumers. Thus, we suggest that the developers of the DGAs consider how to communicate the key messages to consumers as they develop those messages and focus on public dissemination of the guidance. How can we make sure that the dietary guidelines achieve more prominence with consumers than unsubstantiated social media messages? One potential solution is to include individuals with food technology, consumer education expertise on the DGAC. One other point I'd like to make is that Dr. Garza earlier addressed the interplay between DRIs and DGAs, and in fact, so did Dr. Rasmussen. One important distinction is that the DGAC is comprised of a wide range of expertise necessary to develop general food and dietary recommendations and is advisory, whereas the DRI committees, by contrast, are comprised of scientists with expertise on specific facets of a single topic and have a very specific mandate. Therefore, we do not believe that Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee report should be the basis for regulations such as the recent application of the daily value for added sugars to nutrition labelling. A more rigorous scientific evaluation should be applied given that dietary guidelines are transient and can be changed if they need to be, whereas regulations takes over 20 years to change nutrition labelling. Perhaps this could be addressed by ensuring that the DRI process is systematically and proactively funded to develop the quantitative recommendations, both macronutrient and micronutrient, that are needed for accurate DGAC development, similar to the ASN comments. In closing, thank you for the opportunity to provide these comments. We are committed to help get the process right, as dietary guidelines that are transparent and developed by a scientifically rigorous process will ensure credibility with consumers and encourage implementation by the public. Thank you.
Here. Next speaker is Mary Raimondi from the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. I want to remind the speakers to try to stay within the 3-minute limit. Thank you.
This is really big type, so don't worry. All right, so we appreciate this opportunity to comment on the process of the dietary guidelines. Representing over 75,000 members, the Academy is committed to improving health and believes that the dietary guidelines is the cornerstone of this. We commend HHS and USDA for their commitment to the Nutrition Evidence Library and their efforts to strengthen the evidence-based, rigorous, and reproducible approach for assessing the scientific literature. Developing guidelines and systematic reviews are very time-consuming and resource-intensive. Using existing reviews are advantageous by being thoroughly vetted for methodology and bias assessment. We only have a few recommendations that I want to share. One is strengthening the existing transparency. The second is substituting a full guidance update every 5 years with evidence mapping, and then include consumer research. For the first one, the process already offers transparency, but more public input might help strengthen it. We recommend that project protocols, including the proposed questions, search plans, be open to the public for review and adequate time for comment. Opening the protocol, we recommend that it includes inclusion, exclusion criteria, rationale for questions, and adequate time to respond. For the second one, conducting evidence mapping rather than a full guidance guideline update every 5 years will help. Evidence mapping on topics will scan the literature in broad topic areas and help identify gaps in the current guidelines. Mapping update will also help nutrition programs that use dietary guidelines as their guide to be most effective, as it takes many resources, both time and money, for all partners to implement changes every 5 years. I want to say we'd like to see consumer research included in the science review to help assure healthy behavior changes. This will be helpful in drafting recommendations by reviewing and understanding the barriers for consumers. The NEL and the systematic reviews provide useful information on how to align dietary guidelines in practice, but it can get lost in the report or hard to find for practitioners or consumers. To help bridge the gap between research and translation for consumers, we suggest more support to create visual graphics to explain the entire process and the reason for changes. Changes are good, but the consumers might not always see it that way or understand it. We commend the Center for Nutrition Policy and Promotion on their messaging to consumers with such limited resources and recommend an increase in resources. Academy members will continue to promote motivating messages, integrating into their practices, programs, and intervention to increase the success of the dietary guidelines. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Colette Heimowitz from Atkins Nutritionals.
Oh, well, that'll be okay. My name is Colette Heimowitz. I'm the Chief Scientist and Vice President of Nutrition at Atkins Nutritionals, and I appreciate the opportunity to provide a perspective around the USDA guidelines. This is an important discussion with the future of Americans' health weighing heavily on the decisions made by this committee. There are many data points that demonstrate U.S. dietary guidelines need to be more inclusive, and in the review of the supporting science needs to be expanded. The major challenges we see in implementing the guidelines are: one, first and foremost, 52% of the population has been diagnosed with prediabetes or diabetes, according to the Journal of American Medical Association. Recommending 50 to 60% of calories in the form of carbohydrate to that segment of the population with a carbohydrate intolerance is not very productive. The guidelines currently are one-size-fits-all approach, and yet we all know that nutrition is a personalized approach that can never be one-size-fits-all. So I strongly recommend a more personalized approach for disease prevention. So the biggest opportunities we see for the DGAs to promote chronic disease prevention and ensure nutritional sufficiency are: one, currently the United States guidelines are not meeting the needs of the overweight, obese, pre-diabetic, and diabetic citizen, which is more than half of the population. This is precisely the target population with a lower carbohydrate diet that can be effective for. We can reverse the $25 billion spent annually managing diabetes if we start the conversation on the impact of high carbohydrate eating patterns to avoid the onset of diabetes. The science supporting lower carbohydrate eating is overwhelmingly strong in the past 2 decades and support the safety and efficacy, especially for people with metabolic syndrome. All of the research, which spans carbohydrate intake from 40 grams of carbohydrate daily to 120 grams of carbohydrate daily, consistently demonstrate that individuals with metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, and type 2 diabetes are likely to see symptomatic as well as objective improvements in biomarkers of disease risk. If we could get people to lower their carb intake to 100 grams a day, they could benefit greatly. Currently, if a person were following the dietary guidelines, they will consume, on average, 200 to 300 grams of carbohydrate a day. We applaud that the dietary guidelines are focused on improving health and public health and wellness, but we're ignoring 50% of the population. However, the process for the development needs to be revised to ensure that the mandate is clear. It should address the growing needs of a pre-diabetic and overweight population and include a greater diversity of the science in the NEL library as well as the science advisory panel. None of the peer-reviewed studies on the low carbohydrate can be found in the NEL, despite the fact that 14 of them were funded by the NIH and met the inclusion criteria. These studies and others funded by the ADA, AHA, and universities around the world should be in the consideration set before making recommendations in the future. I believe that one of the best ways to accomplish this is to bring together a more diverse group of advisory board members for the DGAC and to bring differing viewpoints to the discussions. Thank you, and I cannot stress how important this is, and I appreciate this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Sean Lucan from Albert Einstein College of Medicine. Yeah.
Thought it'd be kind to the committee's craning necks. So good afternoon. My name's Sean Lucan, and I'm a family doctor in the Bronx. I care for patients who are low-income minorities, mostly of Afro-Caribbean descent. Most have a low level of health literacy, and most suffer from obesity and diet-related diseases. My comments today draw on my experience caring for my patients, as well as on my expertise in nutrition and influences on dietary behavior as I do research in these areas. With regard to challenges to implementing the dietary guidelines, I think one of the biggest is that the guidelines often speak in terms of food components or constituents, not recognizable foods. This is a problem because patients have a poor understanding of esoteric concepts like calories and saturated fat, and moreover, attention to such food components may not always lead to healthful choices. For example, there are healthful foods that are high in calories with generous saturated fat content, like some nuts, and unhealthful foods relatively low in calories that are fat-free, like various ultra-processed foods designed by industry to meet guideline food component recommendations. A second challenge with regard to the DGAs relates to cultural inclusiveness. For example, none of the guidelines' 3 eating patterns clearly translate to Afro-Caribbean traditions, and all include a food group, i.e. dairy, to which most of my African American patients are physiologically intolerant. As to opportunities, I think these follow from the challenges. The biggest opportunity, I think, would be a focus on specific foods, both foods to choose or emphasize, and those to limit or avoid, not ambiguous food categories or constituents. Patients don't generally understand terms like refined grains. They understand words like white rice. Patients don't generally understand protein foods, or rather they often misunderstand this to mean only meat. They understand words like beans and lentils. A second opportunity for the DGAs relates to cultural cognizance and speaking in terms of specific foods that make sense in ethnic traditions and biological constraints. You can search the entire DGA document and see no mention of dasheen, dumplings, callaloo, or oxtail. And for those who are lactose intolerant, they get the mostly unhelpful advice to choose dietary non-dairy alternatives based on esoteric food constituents like magnesium. Of course, there are other challenges and opportunities for the DGAs, particularly related to sustainability, food preparation, issues of affordability and access. But since my time is almost up, let me just focus on what I view as the most critical issue, and that's integrity. The process that generated this scientific report of the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee was rigorous and admirable. But some of how that report got translated into the DGAs had less to do with science and more to do with lobbying, politics, and special interests. That compromise is my biggest challenge to implementing the dietary guidelines. Having an independent body to identify who should direct the scientific reviews with attention to rigor, comprehensiveness, and protections against bias and conflicts, and who should draft and subsequently approve final guidelines would restore faith and provide greater motivation to implement the guidelines clinically. Thank you, and I'm happy to talk further if committee is interested.
Next speaker is Tejas Bhatt from the Institute of Food Technologists.
Good afternoon. The Institute of Food Technologists appreciates the opportunity to comment on the review of the process to update the dietary guidelines for Americans. Founded in 1939, the Institute of Food Technologists, or what we're also lovingly called IFT, is committed to advancing the science of food. Our nonprofit scientific professional society consists of more than 17,000 members from more than 95 countries. We bring together food scientists, technologists, and related professionals from academia, government, and industry. IFT believes that food science and technology play an integral role both in the development and implementation of the guidelines. We were disappointed that food scientists and technologists were not among the members of the 2015 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, or DGAC. Through food science and technology, we have decreased sodium, saturated fat, trans fat, sugars, and addressed many of the shortfall in nutrients such as calcium, dietary fibers, and magnesium in the food supply, as noted in the guidelines. Food scientists and technologists provide support to a dynamic and rapidly changing food environment through product reformulations, fortification, enrichment, for example. During the development of future dietary guidelines, we believe discussions related to changes in the food system and supply are best addressed in collaboration with food scientists and technologists. More specifically, food science and technology professionals can provide valuable insights into existing technological capabilities and limitations germane to the food supply and its impact on food manufacturing and food safety, sensory attributes, cost and time constraints, as well as consumer acceptance. An integrated approach to improving the nation's health is critical. IFT strongly urges the agencies that as they plan the process for selecting individuals for the DGAC for future editions of the dietary guidelines, consideration must be given to mandating representations from various disciplines, including food science and technology. The dietary guidelines is the foundation for many federal, state, and local food nutrition programs, public health interventions, and new product formulations and reformulations. Therefore, IFT also recommends that agencies continue to ensure that future DGAC recommendations are supported by the best scientific evidence available at that time. IFT and our members are committed to assisting the dietary guidelines process. IFT respectfully requests that the review committee recommend to the Departments of Agriculture and Health and Human Services that food scientists and technologists be included in future DGAC. Thank you for the opportunity to comment.
Next speaker is Guy Johnson from McCormick Science Institute.
Hi, everybody. I'm Guy Johnson, Executive Director of the McCormick Science Institute. We are dedicated to increasing scientific understanding of the potential health benefits of culinary spices and herbs. And I have one word for you guys: flavor. It is well known that the biggest barrier to healthier eating is the perception that healthy foods lack flavor. Yet it is not on the radar screen of the dietary guidelines or its process. Specifically, if you search the dietary guidelines, it uses the word healthy 426 times. You know how many times it mentions flavor or taste? You got it, none. But there's an opportunity here too, because healthy foods do not have to taste bad, And the research that we have funded at MSI, and believe me, this goes well beyond spices and herbs, but the research I have is with spices and herbs, shows that they have been used to help free-living people reduce their sodium content by about 1,000 milligrams per day after 5 months. We can totally compensate for the lack of flavor in reduced fat and calorie meals, select meals. And we've also shown that spices and herbs can be used to increase the acceptability and consumption of vegetables among preschool kids. So we think that the dietary guidelines should take this head on, because dietary recommendations don't really do much if they can't be implemented. And we figure there's a big opportunity here. So there are a bunch of different ways that you could get a handle on this. One is to change the composition of the committee or broaden it. I agree with IFT that it would be great to have a food scientist on the committee. There used to be someone who could represent that. Maybe somebody with culinary expertise, maybe somebody who understands consumer understanding. Not to change the science around the recommendations, but to just recognize that implementation and the way that they impact real life is a factor. There could be emphasis on home cooking and the use of flavor to increase the acceptability of healthier foods. You could use the same principles for packaged foods, really, and there's often been a discussion about the possibility of a separate committee based on translation, of how to translate the guidelines into real life in all the many settings that they're used. So we believe that there has never been a time when consumers are more focused on health and wellness, and we have a great opportunity to show them that healthy foods can taste just as good as the other kinds of foods that they like. Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Our next speaker is Cara Brumfield from 1,000 Days.
On behalf of 1,000 Days, thank you for the opportunity to provide comments on the process to update the dietary guidelines. By way of background, 1,000 Days works in the U.S. and around the world to improve nutrition during the 1,000 days between a woman's pregnancy and her child's second birthday. We promote action and investment in nutrition in order to build a strong foundation for children, their families, and their nations to thrive. I'd like to begin by responding to the question posed in the recent call for comments regarding challenges to implementing the dietary guidelines. Although the dietary guidelines for Americans has a really strong history of providing evidence-based nutritional guidance, an important population has been overlooked: pregnant women and young children. This gap presents a significant challenge to those who would use the guidelines to inform policies and programs for these populations, as well as for parents, caregivers, and physicians who might be informed by such guidance. Pregnancy and the first 2 years provide a critical window of opportunity to build a strong foundation for health and development and to prevent future chronic disease through good nutrition. This is why dietary guidelines that take into account the unique nutritional needs, eating patterns, and developmental stages of infants and toddlers from birth to 2 years of age, as well as the nutritional needs of pregnant women, are so important. A growing body of scientific evidence indicates that the foundations for lifelong health, including predispositions to obesity and certain chronic diseases, are largely set during pregnancy and the first 2 years of a child's life. And good nutrition early in life provides the essential building blocks for brain development, healthy growth, and a strong immune system. Poor nutrition, on the other hand, can predispose children to obesity, heart disease, diabetes, and other obesity-related diseases, as well as cognitive and behavioral problems that can last a lifetime. And this is also a critical time for the development of food preferences and habits that will carry children throughout their lives. Credible evidence-based recommendations for pregnant women and children and young children will provide parents, caregivers, and the people and programs that reach them the information they need to give children their best chance to lead healthy, prosperous lives free of preventable chronic disease. As such, 1,000 Days strongly supports the development of the first ever set of dietary guidelines for pregnant women and children under age 2 as part of the next set of the dietary guidelines in 2020. To respond to the second question in the call for comments, these guidelines have an opportunity to promote the prevention of chronic disease and ensure nutritional sufficiency right from the start in the first 1,000 days. In order to seize this opportunity, the dietary guidelines can and should, 1, address the issues of added sugars in the diets of infants and toddlers, and 2, promote the benefits of breastfeeding. With regards to added sugars, we urge you to consider the scientific evidence that links food and beverages loaded with added sugars to poorer health, and to use that information to ensure that the guidelines accurately reflect the importance of avoiding added sugars in the diet. According to the American Heart Association, children under age 2 should not consume any foods or beverages with added sugars, yet more than half of toddlers and preschoolers consume 1 or more sugar-sweetened beverages per day, and 50% of baby snacks and 83% of toddler snacks contain added sweeteners. What's more, the sugar industry has a history of downplaying research that demonstrates the negative health impacts of sugar, and close to 60% of baby and toddler food and drink advertising dollars were spent on sugar-sweetened toddler drinks and nutritionally poor baby and toddler snacks. This puts the current and future health of children at risk. With regards to breastfeeding, we urge you to consider the scientific evidence that shows the health, immunity, and developmental benefits of breast milk, and to ensure that the guidelines strongly support breastfeeding. There is compelling evidence showing that a longer duration of breastfeeding is associated with lower risk for overweight, obesity, and type 2 diabetes later in life. In fact, the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that babies are fed exclusively breast milk for the first 6 months, with continued breastfeeding thereafter, yet almost 20% of babies in the United States are never breastfed. This has significant consequences for the health of both women and children, and while there are numerous factors, the impact of the inappropriate marketing of infant formula cannot be understated. To that end, we'd also like to offer a few comments on the creation of the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. The advisory committee must include experts on breastfeeding and nutrition for infants, toddlers, and pregnant women. However, a range of expertise does not necessitate a range of opinions or viewpoints on matters of scientific consensus, such as the health dangers of sugar and the superiority of breast milk over formula. In particular, we urge you to take all necessary steps to prevent industry interests from having any participation in or influence over the advisory committee or any other aspect of the creation of the dietary guidelines. 1,000 Days is dedicated to supporting the process of creating the first ever dietary guidelines for pregnant women and children that are based in the most credible and up-to-date science available, and we look forward to staying engaged as the process continues in years to come. Thank you.
Next speaker is Emma Gregory from the American Frozen Food Institute.
Hi, my name is Emma Gregory. I'm Senior Manager of Scientific and Regulatory Affairs at the American Frozen Food Institute. We are very excited on behalf of its members to provide comment to you today, and thank you for the opportunity. AFI is the voice of the frozen food industry and the trade association that promotes and represents the interests of all segments of the frozen food industry. Our members welcome the dietary guidelines as a source of science-backed nutrition and diet recommendations. As the committee is aware, the dietary guidelines greatly affect the food industry, especially as they develop products for participation in federal feeding programs and strive to offer products to consumers that incorporate learnings from sound dietary guidance. Our members are a clear stakeholder and contributor to meeting public health goals. For example, frozen food companies have reformulated products and even eliminated several iterations of products that are offered in schools to meet the nutrition parameters outlined in the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act. Now, companies will also update their nutrition facts labels for the first time in 20 years in accordance with FDA's final rule. In both of these examples, among others, they stemmed from recommendations made in the dietary guidelines for Americans. However, AFI would like to raise some challenges related to this. The recommendations within the dietary guidelines for Americans have varied from version to version and is updated more frequently than food regulations that implement that dietary guidance. Regulation development, the proposal, and the public comment period, and then the finalization, implementation, and evaluation of their effects simply cannot keep pace. For example, consider that the nutrition facts label has not been updated for 20 years. The definition of healthy is now being revised among several other food regulations. AFI asks the committee to please consider how the dietary guidelines should be applied to regulations, seeing that the current process for developing, finalizing, and implementing regulations is lengthy and resource intensive. While the dietary guidelines provide critical science-based nutrition recommendations, the extensive National Academy of Sciences investigations to determine DRIs for individual nutrients cannot be replaced. We would also like to raise opportunities for the future of the dietary guidelines. The dietary guidelines will now include dietary advice for pregnant women, infants, and children up to 24 months. For this vulnerable subset of Americans, food safety is deeply entwined with nutritional advice, and any food guidance should contain evidence-based food safety recommendations. Currently, an appendix of food safety recommendations is included in the dietary guidelines, but it is developed by the nutrition-focused academics on the advisory committee. The birth to 24-month age range is a particularly vulnerable subset of our population, and therefore a food scientist and technologist would be critical to the report, to the development of these recommendations, and for the consideration of any special report on this population that would be given to the advisory committee. Health professionals, government agencies, and others who implement the dietary guidelines would benefit from greater education on food safety for this population when they advise parents who are feeding the younger members of their family. Such topics could include the importance of validated cooking instructions on food packaging or instructions for eliminating any potential foodborne pathogens. Thank you for the opportunity today, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you. We're not going to take questions now, but afterwards.
Okay.
Next speaker is Susan Levin from the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine.
Thank you for this opportunity to comment about updates to the dietary guidelines. My comments today are going to address the selection of the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee members. I'm a dietitian who has worked in nutrition, education, and research, advocating for healthier eating in order to prevent and even reverse the chronic disease epidemics from which many Americans now suffer. The last two committees' reports have shown progress in understanding that dietary patterns are where the focus needs to lie and where the conversation needs to begin with healthcare professionals and health advocates. The expertise, therefore, lacking or missing on the committee is that of researchers with detailed knowledge of plant-based or vegetarian dietary patterns. The last dietary guidelines publication listed vegetarian diets specifically as one of 3 examples of healthful eating. The Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics has said that vegetarian diets are not only healthful, but may provide health benefits for the prevention and treatment of certain diseases, including heart disease, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, certain cancers, and obesity. Following the lead of these and other nutrition-focused guidelines, the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee should have representation in the area of evidence-based vegetarian eating patterns. In other words, if not a single person who is an expert in vegetarian diets is selected for the committee, something is seriously wrong with the selection process. While components of the diets are important, including sodium, fiber, saturated fat, and cholesterol, and the researchers in these areas of study have been exceptional committee members, it is past time to select the lead researchers in the area of plant-based eating. I'm asking that this esteemed committee recommend that the selection of the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee include a process where experts in plant-based eating patterns are nominated and selected to serve so that those experts may review and convey the recommendations that are consistently recommended by the DGAs themselves and by other healthcare groups. Thank you.
Next speaker is Tia Raines from the Egg Nutrition Center.
Thank you. On behalf of the Egg Nutrition Center, thank you for this opportunity. ENC is a team of food and nutrition experts within the American Egg Board, one of 22 research and promotion boards that operates under USDA oversight. Our primary function is to fund and monitor nutrition research and utilize our expertise to interpret new research findings within the context of the existing evidence. We translate this information to health practitioners and consumers and educate on how eggs fit within the recommended dietary patterns and the dietary guidelines for Americans. I will focus my comments primarily on standards of evidence as it relates to drawing conclusions in support of the guidelines, and also offer a few thoughts on selecting advisory committee members. Defensible and credible dietary guidance arises from applying an objective and consistent set of evidentiary standards to the available scientific evidence so that bias is minimized and conclusions are valid. Users of the dietary guidelines in the advisory report will benefit from a clear understanding of how new research is identified and considered for review, and most importantly, how evidentiary strength grades are defined. This means establishing a standard by which such grades as strong, moderate, or weak are assigned so that the reader can have confidence that the conclusions genuinely represent how compelling the science behind a particular recommendation is. In this regard, it is important for the guidelines and advisory report to convey the relative rigor of the types of studies evaluated, and specifically, clearly acknowledge the type of available evidence, such as the presence of randomized controlled trials versus prospective cohort studies, and clearly acknowledge the limitations in drawing diet and health conclusions for the available evidence. In addition, the credibility of guidance will be maximized if the reasons for sometimes using expert reports of other organizations are clearly explained and justified. Although the guidelines process typically assesses scientific articles that have been published since the previous cycle, it is evident that prior conclusions need to be subject to scrutiny as well in light of the sophistication of the science and data interpretation that's occurred over time. The deletion of specific cholesterol guidance from the current DGA is an example of how long-standing guidance may require updating in light of new evidence, or in this case, the lack of evidence that dietary cholesterol significantly influences LDL cholesterol. Finally, with respect to the selection of an advisory committee for this process, most nutrition scientists would agree that evaluating the totality of science is a complex endeavor that benefits from diet and health experts from different sectors. The purpose of the DGA is not only to express a scientific consensus on optimal nutrition, but also to develop recommendations that promote positive behavior changes, whether for the public or the food industry. Therefore, such fields as behavioral psychology, food technology, and economics may be sources of valuable advisors, in addition to traditional experts in nutrition research. A committee that is diverse not only in expertise, but also in geography, institutional affiliation, and life experience may provide a richer mix of scientific discussion and deliberation. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you, and thank you for your service to nutrition.
Next speaker is Jim O'Hara from the Center for Science and the Public Interest.
Good afternoon. Thank you. I am the Director of Health Promotion Policy at CSPI. CSPI is a science-based public interest group that has been involved in the Dietary Guideline Advisory Committee process going back 20 or more years. We would like to remind you that the driving force for the creation of this committee was in fact the political pressure brought by industry in Congress because of the 2015 Dietary Guideline Advisory Committee's sensible recommendation that there be a reduction of the consumption of red meat to produce both the public and the planet's health. That is why we are thankful that you are taking your charge seriously and moving beyond the politics. In fact, as you've heard today, the 2015 Dietary Advisory Guidance Committee's scientific report was rigorously reviewed and put together, probably more so than any of the previous editions. Can it be improved? Absolutely. Any process can be improved. However, the real threat could be recommendations that are either infeasible or so blue sky in scope that they lead to the demise of the dietary guideline themselves. That is the hope of some in industry for many years now. So we would ask that you not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. But this takes us to your important question of how to make the dietary guidelines in fact prevent chronic disease for Americans. And we would again remind you that even the most perfect dietary guidelines are up against literally billions of dollars of industry marketing dollars. If any of you spent any time over the last weekend watching football, you saw the ads for quart-sized shakes, cheese-filled pizza, and other foods that in fact have led to our epidemics of obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. To make a real dent in those diseases, what really is required is that the dietary guidelines include policy interventions. For instance, soda taxes, warning labels, front of package labeling. Those are the kinds of interventions that can in fact create a bulwark against the industry's advertising and marketing. So we would ask you to consider making certain that the forthcoming dietary guidelines include policy interventions. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your work.
Speaker is Darlena Birch from the National WIC Association.
Good afternoon. I am Darlena Birch, registered dietitian and public health nutritionist at the National WIC Association. The National WIC Association is the education arm and advocacy voice of the 12,000 WIC service provider agencies and the over 8 million mothers and young children who participate in the supplemental nutrition program for women, infants, and children nationwide. WIC provides quality nutrition education, breastfeeding promotion and education, a monthly prescribed food package, and access to maternal, prenatal, and pediatric services. The WIC food package and nutrition education are the cornerstones of the program, both of which are shaped by the dietary guidelines for Americans. On January 5th this year, the National Academies of Sciences released their recommendations to USDA regarding revisions to the WIC food package. The National WIC Association is thrilled with the recommendations, particularly as they help ensure that the WIC food package is aligned with the 2015 DGAs. These recommendations include increasing the dollar amount of the cash value voucher in order to promote fruit and vegetable consumption, while reducing the amount of added sugar allowed in foods such as yogurt and soy beverages. Through a recent discussion with WIC state agencies, it is found that many WIC participants arrive at clinics armed with false or anecdotal information about food and nutrition, much of which is found online, in tabloids, or from friends and family members. In these instances, the DGAs have served as a tool to defend against misinformation, as WIC's DGA-based nutrition counseling program allows for accurate information to be imparted and, in many cases, reinforced. WIC serves culturally diverse populations across the country. In the same discussion, the agency shared that not all WIC participants feel that the DGAs are culturally relevant to them and their families. To address this concern, NWA suggests that the committee, 1, broadly communicate the DGAs as a valuable education tool for all of our nation's diverse populations, and to ensure that the content is reflective of those populations. These include, for instance, providing examples of foods within programs that acknowledge these populations. 2, universally promote the DGAs across publicly funded food and nutrition programs, such as Head Start, WIC, SNAP, school lunch programs, Meals on Wheels, etc., so that the recommendations will be recognized by the broader public. In addition to our support of the DGAs, NWA encourages the continuation of the process to develop DGAs for pregnant women and birth through 24 months. These populations comprise a large segment of the WIC population. DGAs for these life stages, therefore, will be most impactful. The DGAs provide a standard by which WIC and many other communities measure nutrition adequacy within populations. We commend the committee for their hard work and look forward to continued participation in the review process to update the dietary guidelines for Americans. Thank you.
Next is Lee Sanders in place of Julia Kennard from the American Bakers Association.
Good afternoon. My name is Lee Sanders. I'm the Senior Vice President for Government Relations and Public Affairs for the American Bakers Association. Thank you for the opportunity to respond to your request for comments regarding the dissemination and implementation of the dietary guidelines for Americans. ABA believes that the U.S. dietary guidelines could further promote chronic disease prevention and ensure nutritional sufficiency by recognizing the critical importance of folic acid enrichment and by including comprehensive and robust information on the health benefits of enriched grains. It is very appropriate, most appropriate really, that we make these comments during National Folic Acid Awareness Week. The 2015 Dietary Guidelines recommends limited consumption of refined grains and does not distinguish between nutrient-rich enriched grains and other refined grains. The dietary guidance does not sufficiently communicate the public health benefit of enriched grains, which are an important source of folic acid essential to women of childbearing years. Since folic acid fortification became required in 1998, the prevalence of babies born with neural tube defects, also known as NTDs, was decreased by 35% in the United States, leading the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to name folic acid fortification one of its top 10 public health achievements for the first decade of the 21st century. The CDC reaffirmed its declaration in a January 2015 study in which researchers found that about 1,300 babies are born each year without an NTD who might otherwise have been affected. The CDC thus concluded that folic acid fortification of enriched grains continues to be an important way to help prevent NTDs. Yet the 2015 dietary guidelines steer women of childbearing years away from food that have played a critical role in reducing the prevalence of birth defects by recommending that individuals increase their consumption of whole grains and limit their intake of refined grains without distinguishing between nutrient-rich enriched grains and other types of refined grains. Whole grains do not contain folic acid that enriched grains do. Whole grains are not enriched with folic acid or any other nutrient. In fact, they are prohibited in the food additive regulations from being enriched. While whole grains contain a small amount of naturally occurring folate, it's less bioavailable than the added synthetic folic acid found in enriched grains. Thus, the current dietary guidelines would better serve the health of women of childbearing age if it recognized the importance of folic acid enrichment and included educational information on the health benefits of enriched grains. Thank you again for the opportunity to provide comments today on behalf of the American Bakers Association. We'd be glad to provide additional information if needed. Thank you.
Next, I believe, is Joan Younger from the American Academy of Pediatrics section on breastfeeding.
Good afternoon. I would like to thank the National Academies of Science for the opportunity to speak at today's sessions on reviewing the process to update the dietary guidelines for Americans. My name is Joan Younger-Meek, and I do chair the section on breastfeeding of the American Academy of Pediatrics, and these remarks are supported by the American Academy of Pediatrics. I'm also the immediate past chair of the United States Breastfeeding Committee, and professionally, I'm a fellow of the American Academy of Pediatrics, a fellow of the Academy of Breastfeeding Medicine, a registered dietitian, and an international board-certified lactation consultant. The dietary guidelines for Americans provide important guidance for pediatricians and other healthcare providers as they provide anticipatory guidance regarding nutrition and healthy lifestyles to the parents of children older than 2. It is critical that these dietary guidelines are based upon high-quality scientific evidence. It is also important that the expert panels that review this evidence represent scientists and practitioners from a broad range of backgrounds, including both researchers and practitioners. In regards to dietary guidance for pregnancy and birth to 24 months of age, obstetricians and pediatricians should be included in these advisory committees. The dietary guidelines are also important in that they help to inform federal nutrition programs such as WIC. It is an important step that the 2020 Dietary Guidelines for Americans will include evidence-based assessment of nutritional guidance for our youngest children birth to 24 months. This is the period of the most rapid growth of the entire lifespan. Nutritional deficiencies in this period may lead to chronic deficiencies and even irreversible developmental delays. On the other hand, optimal nutrition during the fetal period through age 2 is important in promoting appropriate growth and helping to prevent both acute infectious diseases as well as chronic diseases such as obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. The first food for children should be human breast milk. Provision of human milk requires other societal support beyond the scope of this committee. However, the guidelines should follow the recommendations of the American Academy of Pediatrics and other professional medical and nutritional academies for exclusive breastfeeding for about 6 months, continued breastfeeding after the introduction of complementary solids for at least the first year of life, and continued breastfeeding thereafter as long as desired by the family. Best evidence for introduction of complementary foods should be updated as the review progresses. Appropriate nutritional support for pregnant and breastfeeding women is a corollary to this recommendation. The WIC program provides important guidance and support to breastfeeding women and to breastfed children. The American Academy of Pediatrics 2012 policy statement on breastfeeding and the use of human milk recommended an exclusive human milk diet with fortification for all premature infants born weighing less than 1,500 grams. Ideally, this diet is provided by the baby's own mother, but in cases in which the mother is unable to provide adequate express milk to meet full nutritional needs, or in cases in which the mother has a contraindication to breastfeeding, pasteurized donor human milk may be used. The DGA should recognize this important provision of nutrition as a deterrent to the development of necrotizing enterocolitis, or NEC, in this most vulnerable premature infant population. The risk of developing NEC increases exponentially when infant formula is fed instead of human milk. It is critical that the DGA process be driven by sound nutritional science so that the federal government can provide the best advice to families on healthy diets. It's important that this process provide nutritional guidance which is free from political and industry interference. Any key informants, decision makers, or committee members must freely disclose any conflicts of interest, especially in regards to relationships to food or formula industry. For the birth to 24-month guidelines, manufacturers of infant formula should not have undue influence on this process. In closing, I support the development of the 2020 DGA through a process that incorporates an evidence-based review of the scientific literature. The process should involve experts in the medical fields representing pregnant women, infants, and children. From a public health perspective, the guidelines for birth through age 24 months should strongly support human milk feeding. Finally, the process should be free from commercial and industry conflict of interest. Thank you for the opportunity to address the committee today.
Next speaker is Angela Amico, PSPI, on behalf of Lorrene Ritchie from the Nutrition Policy Institute.
Hi, everyone. Good evening now. My name is Angela Amico, and I'm going to be giving comments on behalf of Lorrene Ritchie with the University of California Nutrition Policy Institute. So keep that in mind as I read her credentials. I am the director of the Nutrition Policy Institute and a cooperative extension specialist. I have a doctorate in nutrition, am a registered dietitian, and have conducted nutrition research for over 2 decades. The University of California's Nutrition Policy Institute is known for conducting rigorous research to inform and strengthen nutrition policy. While I have not served on the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, in 2005 I was among the first evidence analysts trained in the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics evidence analysis process, after which much of the nutrition evidence library process is modeled. In 2006, I was the lead author of the first Academy position paper to use the systematic review process. Collectively at the Nutrition Policy Institute, we have reviewed hundreds of scientific publications involving a spectrum of research designs. We have also reviewed evidence tabulated by other analysts to answer questions and derive recommendations, the same process used by the 2015 DGAC. I have carefully examined the methods chapter of the 2015 report and can can attest that the committee did an outstanding job of systematic review protocol, the highest bar for evidence analysis. Earlier today, we heard of the reasons why this process should be commended and continued. It is systematic, it is thorough, it is inclusive of many different types of studies, it is transparent through notice of public comment periods, and it is designed to minimize bias. This rigorous approach is warranted given that the dietary guidelines are the evidence-based foundation for the recommendations for the health of the population as a whole and for environments to support healthy eating. And because of nutrition environments and the importance that they matter in our diets from the very beginning of life, I applaud the USDA and HHS for their plans to include pregnant women and young children from birth to 24 months of age in the next guidelines. Nutrition early in life is critical for setting the stage for a lifetime of health. A greater challenge than determining what Americans should eat, however, is identifying better ways to help them eat better and follow the guidelines. Overall, the American diet is still not close to meeting the guidelines. Evidence suggests that changes to the food environment coupled with nutrition education are key to realize the potential of the dietary guidelines. In conclusion, nutrition is a continuously evolving science that is critical to human health and well-being. With regular reassessment of the evidence, the central findings and recommendations of the guidelines become stronger, while new science helps to uncover emerging areas of focus. The challenge before us is to create a culture where these recommendations can become affordable, convenient, and socially acceptable so that all Americans are able and willing to follow them. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Last speaker on this list is Pauline Sakamoto from Human Milk Banking Association in North America.
Thank you for this opportunity to provide an update for the dietary guidelines for Americans. I am Pauline Sakamoto. I'm a public health nurse, executive director of the longest and oldest nonprofit milk bank in the U.S., past president of the Human Milk Banking Association of North America, commonly called HMBANA, if you can get that, and also a board member of the U.S. Breastfeeding Committee. Thank you all for your tireless support of families, mothers, and infants. This committee does great work for the American people, and it is my honor, actually, to be here. As a representative of various organizations, we commend your historic decision to include guidelines for pregnant women and children from birth to 24 months. The dietary intake during this period builds a foundation for lifelong health and wellness in families, which also strengthens our communities and our country. Additionally, the cost benefits of breastfeeding and human milk are proven and life-saving. It is our recommendation that the advisory committee selection process remains transparent, free of bias, conflict of interest, and addresses the diverse economic realities of this nation. Your vetting process must continue to eliminate the potential of for-profit interests to interfere with the public good. We continue to look to your leadership to protect the most innocent infants who thrive through the work of this committee. As an overview, we suggest the following 3 points. We recommend the advisors to the committee contain individuals with knowledge and appreciation of the evidence of the health and development benefits of human milk, breastfeeding, and milk banking for infants 0 to 24 months. We urge you to include members who are committed to access for all families to the education and knowledge and support for breastfeeding. We recommend the guidelines be developed based on all current national and international guidelines for breastfeeding, initiation, duration, and exclusivity. We believe the current knowledge is excellent, and what is needed is to create national guidelines to protect the health benefits for mothers and infants of all social and economic experiences in our country. We need your leadership to utilize current best practice and put them into federal mandates. We strongly recommend that donor human milk from established Humana banks, like ours in San Jose, to be included in your guidelines. The population of vulnerable infants whose mothers cannot breastfeed because of illness, surgery, medication regimens, and is staggering. As we know, the evidence shows the positive outcomes of a breast milk diet in the premature infant under 1,500 grams, as Dr. Joan Younger-Meek presented, is a recommendation is highly recommended, and it's very, the health imperative is impressive when it is a all human milk diet. Your recommendations and federal support will save lives of infants and babies and support the American health we all so deeply care about. Again, thank you for your time and tireless efforts to protect families, mothers, and infants. And I will be more than happy to give more information at any time. Thank you.
This committee has been scheduled to end the day now. I've been asked to allow a few more minutes for a few speakers who have comments, and I don't know who they are. Would you come up and introduce yourself, please?
Got it. Good evening. I'm Dr. Jeanette Crenshaw, a registered nurse and researcher, and I'm the current chair of the United States Breastfeeding Committee. The USBC is a coalition of more than 50 multi-sectorial organizations that support our mission to drive collaborative efforts for policy and practices that create a landscape of breastfeeding support across the U.S. Thank you for this opportunity to provide comments, and bravo on your decision to include the guidelines for pregnant women and young children from birth to 24 months. These guidelines may play a pivotal role in reducing diet-related chronic disease, ensuring optimal child health, and reducing health disparities. We have 3 recommendations. Our first focuses on the members of the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. We recommend that the selection process be transparent and public, including nominees' institutional and funding affiliations. And please include experts on the evidence of pregnancy, infant, and child nutrition with specific expertise on the evidence of breast milk as a first food. You've already heard testimony on the benefits of breastfeeding and the risks of not breastfeeding. These experts should be without bias, specifically corporate interests such as relationships with companies that market inappropriate food for infants and children. Our second recommendation focuses on the rigor of the evidence of the DGAs. Use of guidelines based on rigorous science can improve population health, and we urge you to continue the same rigor, free of bias. Our third and final recommendation is that the pregnancy and newborn to 24-month guidelines be informed by existing national guidelines for breastfeeding initiation, duration, and exclusivity. Breastfeeding practices that are consistent with our national recommendations improve maternal and newborn health, reduce healthcare costs, and save scarce healthcare resources. The USBC will remain engaged during the review process. We support the appointment of strong, neutral experts and the use of a robust process for developing the 2020 Dietary Guidelines for Americans. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Kristen Strader, and on behalf of Public Citizen, I thank you for the opportunity to comment. Public Citizen is a nonprofit consumer advocacy organization with over 400,000 members and supporters nationwide. We serve as the people's voice in the nation's capital and advocate for policies that protect public health without influence from corporations.
Due to the profit-driven nature of commercial industries, Public Citizen encourages the Academy to recommend that 1, DGA advisory committee members should not include members of any industry with related commercial interests, such as the infant formula industry, or any individual with financial ties to any such industry. And 2, studies funded by industries with related commercial interests, such as the infant formula industry, should not be included in the systematic review for informing DGA recommendations. Industry-funded research is inherently biased, and that bias would influence a committee's decision should an industry member be included. A committee free of corporate influence will minimize conflicts of interest and ensure that decisions are made in the best interest of public health rather than corporate wealth. It is especially important that the health and well-being of infants be the top priority when the DGA Advisory Committee develops the B through 24 section of the guidelines. The infant formula industry has made attempts to be included in the advisory committee process. Those attempts should be rejected by the federal officials who oversee the advisory committee process. The DGAs should be developed consistent with recommendations made by other federal agencies. There is overwhelming consensus among governmental public health agencies that exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months of a baby's life offers significant health and economic benefits for mothers, children, and family. The Surgeon General's call to action to support breastfeeding recognizes that higher rates of breastfeeding could save infant lives and billions of dollars in healthcare costs. Action 6 calls to ensure that the marketing of infant formula is conducted in a way that minimizes its negative impacts on exclusive breastfeeding. The United States government should advance public health, not corporate interests. It is imperative for the health and well-being of all Americans, and especially infants, are most vulnerable, that the guidelines widely used by healthcare professionals and average citizens are not influenced by profit-driven corporations. Thank you.